Hi, I'm Barb Switzer. Thank you for coming and joining me for Jeweled Wave Cuff on Beaducation.com. This is a fantastic class both for beginning wire workers and for those with some experience. If you're not familiar with wire or you haven't had a lot of practice, I recommend that you take Lisa Niven-Kelly's Basic Loops class, which is free here on Beaducation. To start this project, I normally begin with pre-oxidized wire, so dirty wire. The reason I do this is because I find it much easier to do the polishing work if I do it as I put the bracelet together versus doing it once the bracelet is fully assembled. To do this, I simply make a simple coil of wire, throw it into some warm liver of sulfur, let it soak until it's black enough, take it out, rinse it, dry it, and start working. You don't want to polish it or do anything to it before you start your project. You will actually assemble the pieces, polish them, and then put the bracelet together. So I want to make sure that when you're working on this project that you are safe. So one of the tools that we've included in this are safety glasses. You want to wear these while you're doing liver of sulfur to make sure nothing splashes into your eyes, as well as when you flush cut your wire, because that's going to result in some crazy flying wire ends. And I find it especially important to do it while you're wrapping because it's very, very easy for that 26 gauge wire to fly up and possibly scratch you in the eye. Safety first, everybody. So next up, we're going to talk a little about tools and materials so that we can get started. The tools used to make the Jeweled Wave Cuff are a 5/8 inch dowel, or a large wrap and tap plier, flush cutters, chain nose pliers, a ruler, round nose pliers, and flat nose pliers. You can opt to use the ruler that's printed in your handout as long as you remember to print your handout at 100% size and not fit to page. Safety glasses, liver of sulfur, pro polish pads, and I often find when I teach this class live that people who don't do a lot of wire work like to use a little finger pro tape. You're going to put that on your non-dominant hand to protect you from the pointy edge of the crystals. The materials used to make the Jeweled Wave Cuff are 100 to 110 3mm bicone crystals, roughly a gram of size 11 seed beads, 50 4.5mm inner diameter 18 gauge jump rings, 22 feet of 26 gauge round dead soft wire, and 5 feet of 18 gauge round dead soft wire. When choosing your beads for this project, I recommend using something like the bicones that have one flat side on them, because that, as you can see in the close-up here, one flat side of the crystal actually sits up against the wave wire, and that's what makes them sit on the edge of the wire. If you use a round crystal, they tend to roll around to the back as you're wrapping them on, and they're very difficult to keep in position. You can go ahead and use a faceted rondelle small bead for this because the bottom side of that is flat, and generally those stay in position also. Whenever you're cutting any heavy gauge wire, you want to make sure that you flush cut the ends of the wire. Every cutter has a pinch side, which is the side we're looking at here, and on the opposite side, a smooth flush finish. And this is the side you want to keep on any wire you cut. As you can see, this wire has a sharp, pointy end. So I'm going to position my flush cutter and trim that end off so it's nice and clean and flush. Once I've flush cut my first piece to 45mm, I then use it as my ruler for cutting all my additional pieces. So I just line it up next to the one piece and cut the next one. For a 7-inch bracelet, I'll cut 25 waves or pieces of wire. Each additional wave plus a jump ring adds 1/4 of an inch to the overall length of the bracelet, so you can go ahead and adjust your size accordingly. Refer to your handout for specific counts on the number of pieces of wire needed to cut to determine the size of bracelet you're trying to make. Here you see a flush cut 45mm long piece of 18 gauge wire, and I'm now going to show how to do the shaping with a dowel. This is a 5/8 inch wooden dowel, easy to find, inexpensive. I'm grabbing the wire and simply pulling it around the dowel. Nothing real difficult here. And I'm creating just a basic U shape. I'm not going to worry about the straight little ends here. As long as you've got this nice curve on the back side, you'll be fine. To bend your wave using a large wrap and tap plier, position the wire so that it's centered about midway on the flat jaw of the plier, and roll as far as you can comfortably. Pull the piece of wire out, position it the same way with the part that's already curved coming back over the plier, and roll it again toward the other end. This will give you a slightly rounder shape than shaping around a dowel, but it's going to end up the same by the time we've put the loops on it. Once you've formed your wave, you're going to take your round nose pliers, position the wire so that you cannot feel it if you rub your finger across the top of the plier, and you're going to roll your hand away from you, open the plier, pivot it back, and roll the rest of the way to form a loop. So you notice that I have a Sharpie mark that I've put on the plier blades, and that's so that all of my loops come out a consistent size. And I've marked it where the plier jaw is about 2.5mm in diameter. So I'm going to make the second loop, roll, open, pivot back, and roll the rest of the way. And you get a nice round loop. It's key when you do this step that you do not remove the plier after you do that first roll of the plier over. Leave it in the loop, open it up, pivot it back, and then continue. So you'll now continue those same steps for the rest of your waves, making a loop on each end. And notice the other thing that's happening here is, note that I'm holding very, very close to the plier and not out on this end of the wire as I'm turning this loop. And that helps to stabilize your wire and keep from distorting the overall shape while you're making this. So very often when you make your waves, you'll end up with them being a little bit warped, or you'll end up with the loops being a little bit open when you get all done. So the next step you want to do is to clean that up and get rid of any curvature, because you want these to sit on a nice flat plane. So I like to use flat nose pliers to do this, and what I do is I just put the component in the plier, and you see I just squeeze the plier closed, and voila, it is flat. And I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. Get in there, give it a nice little gentle squeeze. Don't give it the death grip and mar it up. You just want to go ahead and make sure that's nice and flat. In the case of this one, where my loop is kind of open, I normally will stick my round nose back into the component and just roll it a little bit toward the center and close that up, because you want to make sure the loops are nice and tightly closed. So to start doing your wrap, you're going to cut an 8-inch long piece of 26 gauge wire. I usually use the paper for my instructions and cut it just a little bit shorter than the width of the paper. Take the end of the wire and insert it through the loop on the left-hand side, putting the wire in front of the 18 gauge. And you leave yourself a little tail to hang on to. Don't try and wrap the very end of the wire here. And then you're going to wrap the wire around once or twice right next to the loop. This anchors your wire in position. Then I flip the piece over, putting the loop on the right-hand side, and I take the short tail wire and wrap it through the loop. Notice that when I bring this little short wire around, I pull it all the way into position, pull it back, and then feed it through the loop. I do this because the wire is going to remember where you put it, and so when you wrap it back down, it will go right back into that exact same position. Once I've wrapped it 3 or 4 times, I use either chain or flat nose plier and give it a really good stiff tug. And then I pop the wire up a little bit, slide my nice pointy cutters right in here and trim that end free. And then I'm going to take my chain nose pliers and just sort of tuck and push that end so it sits about center in the inside of the loop. Once you've trimmed off your tail wire, flip the piece over, positioning your loop on the left-hand side. And you've already got 2 wraps on there, so just add 3 more wraps. Position them nice and tight together. You can see I do that by pulling my wire just a little bit over to the left toward that previous wrap. So now I've got a good 5 wraps on here, and I'm going to string a seed bead. So I'm going to position my finger back behind the seed bead and kind of grab a hold of it and pull the wire around behind the 18 gauge. And then wrap 3 more times. As I do this wrap, I make sure I support the bead from behind with my finger as I'm doing it so that it sits up on the edge of the wire. So once I have the seed bead on and 3 wraps, I'm going to string a 3mm crystal. And you want to use a bicone on this, not a round. Again, same thing, hold it in position, pull the wire back behind the wave, and give it 3 good wraps. Now if you feel like there's a lot of gap in them, you can see this wire is soft enough that you can actually tighten that wrapping up a little bit and slide them over to the side using your fingernail. And now I'm going to continue on for another 3 crystals. Now once I've gotten 4 crystals wrapped into place, and I have 3 wraps after the last crystal, the last bead I'm going to string is another size 11 seed bead. And I'm going to do the same thing, wrapping and supporting from behind. And hopefully you've got enough space to do 5 wraps on this side. If you find that it's a little bit too tight as you're doing this, then you might want to do less wraps after the first loop, and then you'll have less wraps after this last one if you feel like your crystals aren't fitting well onto the wave. So I'm going to take this tail and do the same thing I did on the other side, which is wrap it several times through the loop. Anywhere between 3 and 5 times should do it. And again, each time I do this, I pull the wire all the way into position, pull it back, and then feed it through the loop. So I've got a good 4 wraps there. I'm going to pop that wire up a little bit. Get in there with my cutters and snip away that end. And then I'm going to tuck the end down with my chain nose. So same thing as on the first side. Once you've made your whole pile of components, and that's going to be between 23 and 25 depending on the size of your wrist, you're going to make one additional one where you're going to wrap the entire wave with 26 gauge wire. So I'm starting this the same way as the other ones, bringing the tail through the left side loop and putting it in front, holding it down, and then wrapping. I'm not going to stop in the midst of wrapping this one to tuck the tail. I'm going to wait until I've wrapped the entire component and then wrap both of the tails off and trim the wire. I started with a foot of 26 gauge. And you notice as I keep wrapping this, I keep moving my fingers closer to where I'm wrapping so that I don't warp the piece as I'm doing it. You want to keep those wraps nice and tight together. This makes the end part of the clasp stronger so that it'll take a little abuse from putting the bracelet on and taking it off. Clasps always need to be strong. See, I've wrapped the wire all the way up to next to the right hand loop. Tuck the end through and finish wrapping, and then trim the ends. And there's the finished component. So I've cut a 70mm piece of 18 gauge wire and marked the center at 35mm. I'm going to take my flat nose pliers because I actually think they work best for this. And I'm going to position them, because I am right-handed, I'm going to position the pliers just to the right of the mark. If you actually put the plier on the mark, your bend will come out next to the mark. And then I'm going to take the wire, hold it stable with my non-dominant hand close to the plier, and bend. Notice that my mark comes out pretty well centered on that bend. And then I like to come in from the side and squeeze the wire together. It doesn't have to absolutely touch right here. It's fine as long as they're nice and close. If when you do this, your ends come out a little uneven and one is longer than the other, just trim them to match. Once I've done that, I'm going to put a slight bend in the end of my wire close to that fold. And again, I'm going to use my flat nose for this because they're much more powerful. And I'm just going to turn the plier slightly toward myself and make a little bend. And then I'm going to come in with a pair of round nose pliers, position them a little ways down, probably 1/4 of an inch from the end, about 8mm. And go ahead and start to roll this over into a hook. Roll the plier back toward myself, and then I kind of push down with my non-dominant hand to form a nice hook. Then again, with round nose pliers, I'm going to get in here, and I'm going to make the loop in about the same spot on my plier, just a little bit further toward the tip that I used when I was making the loops on all of my waves. So I'm going to roll, open, pivot back, and roll the rest of the way. And then repeat on the opposite side. So as you can see, my results are not exactly perfect here, and this is going to this merits a little bit of cleanup with my pliers, just to make it look a little bit better, because I've got one slightly spastic loop over here. So I'm going to kind of open it up a little bit with my chain nose, come back in with my round nose pliers, and take sort of a second shot at that loop. You can make a lot of changes to the shape of anything made out of wire, even wire as heavy as 18 gauge, if you make your changes by degrees. If you just move things around a little bit at a time, don't just grab it and pull it and expect it to come out perfect the first time around. It might take a little bit of refinement to get everything to look the way you want it to look, especially on the hook. It's a very short, stiff piece of wire. See, with a little bit of work and a little bit of extra attention, I took it from a little bit spastic to quite a bit better. So I'm now going to make the attachment links for adding the clasp to the bracelet. And this is a 1-inch piece of 18 gauge flush cut on both ends. I'm coming in with my round nose pliers. I'm working on Lindstroms, which are pretty small. So I'm working close to the box joint where it's about 4 millimeters in the jaw is about 4 millimeters in diameter. So just like on the other loops, roll, pivot back, and roll the rest of the way. And then repeat on the opposite side. So I'm going to make a total of 4 figure-8 loops, 2 for each end of the bracelet. You may have noticed as I've been putting this bracelet together that my wire is black, and that is because I antiqued the wire before I started, because I find it much easier to assemble the pieces and then polish them and then put the whole bracelet together. You can see here that I've actually gone ahead and started polishing on these jump rings and on the clasp components that I just made. So what I do is I use a straight up nice pro polish pad and just rub it across the surface and take off a little of that patina so that my piece comes out extra lovely and beautiful. I find it far easier to do the polishing on separate pieces versus on an assembled piece of jewelry. It's much harder to polish the assembled piece of jewelry, especially the jump ring portion. And technically you can kind of cheat on this if you oxidize and polish all of the individual pieces and decide you don't really want to do the jump rings. You can go ahead and put these antiqued pieces together with shiny jump rings, and it's pretty hard to tell the difference. So on the pieces with the beads, the polishing isn't a lot harder, but you do have some tight spaces kind of in between the crystals and up here near the loop. And I normally just fold my Pro Polish pad in half and do that, or I use the edge of the Pro Polish pad to work down in between the really tight spaces in between the beads. You can see it's just awkward enough polishing this piece when it's all loose and not attached to anything. Imagine trying to do an equally good job polishing on something that's attached to other things. Not as much fun as doing it this way. And I swear this is faster. Once I have all of my components polished, I'm ready to go ahead and start opening my jump rings. I like to use 2 pairs of flat nose pliers. Some people prefer chain nose or chain nose and bent nose pliers. Use whichever combination of 2 pairs of pliers works best for you, but remember, don't use round nose pliers when you're doing this. You're going to want to open that jump ring from front to back so that it looks like this. So to close the jump ring, I'm going to move the 2 ends past each other and hopefully rub them together and perhaps even make them click. And that way you get a good closure on your seam and you can barely see it. When you get ready to assemble your bracelet, you'll have to decide which side you want to be the front and which side you want to be the back. Because one side of the component you see a lot more crystal, and on the opposite side of the component you see a lot more exposed wire. There is no right or wrong on this. Either side could be the front or back. You just want to make sure that you're consistent when you put it together, that they're all going in the same direction. So I'm going to open the figure eights in a similar way as the jump rings, which is from front to back. So I'm going to go ahead and push that open from the side. And the first thing I'm going to hook in here is the hook for my clasp. And then I'm going to go ahead and just close that up. Open the next 8 and attach it to the other side. And then close that link so that I've got both of the figure 8s attached. Then I'm going to open up the opposite side of both figure 8s and put my first piece into position. It's much easier to do this and make sure you don't get anything flipping over if you attach both of them at the same time and then close them one at a time. The reason I have you put the hook on and start your assembly this direction is because it actually provides you with a nice handle to hang on to while you're putting the piece together. So once you've attached your hook and you have your little handle and a single component on, it's time to continue on with your assembly and add the next component. So you can see I'm hooking the jump ring through both of the loops, and then I'm going to let them hang loose. Pick up my second pair of pliers and close the jump ring. And I do this by wiggling the jump ring back and forth and then getting it nice and even and closed. So now I'm adding the second jump ring, and you notice that I hold the pieces up next to each other so that I make sure that the jump rings are going in straight and that neither of the pieces is flipped over. So I put that in there, and just like on the first one, wiggle my jump ring closed, and there you have it. Once you have these first components attached together, you will continue on in the same fashion until you have all of your components linked together. So I have one figure 8 attached to one loop. I'm going to go ahead and attach the second one and close it up. And just like we did on the opposite side, I'm going to open up both of the links and attach the clasp. Making sure that everything's all oriented properly. And then I'm going to close up those figure 8s. It's all done. Now that you've mastered the wave technique and the basic wrap, what you're going to find is this is a great technique for plenty of other applications, including fantastic necklaces and earrings and any other kind of bracelet or component that you can think of. Have fun with the wave.